Welcome back. Now to the mortgage market we go, and freedoms and property rights in this country. This is a story that the housing finance and bank guys would rather you didn't know about. It's a plan not only to cover up the fraud closure, but to convince Congress to make it legal. Take a look.
It used to be that if you bought a house, your mortgage would stay at a single bank while you paid it off. But now, it's rarely that simple. Instead, imagine millions of different mortgages from all across the country stuck into a blender. Through a process known as securitization, the mortgages are mixed into milkshakes that are then sold to the government housing agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as your retirement funds, your pension. The blender, if you will, is run by a private company called MERS. MERS Electronic Registry tracks what goes in each milkshake and acts as the actual owner of all these mortgages, enabling mortgage swapping without any of that pesky paperwork. In the process, too often, the question of who owns what frequently gets lost, and too often no one is held accountable for ensuring your home has your name tied to your note, a direct breach of the basic principles of independent property rights upon which this country was founded. And now, amid mounting questions about the process and the billions of dollars in lawsuits, the industry is pouring money and lobbying hours into protecting its interests at the expense of ours. Right now, lobbyists on Capitol Hill pushing for legislation that would not only legalize this blender process, but affirm MERS as the standard for tracking mortgages. If that were to happen, the industry could get rid of all the fraud closure lawsuits with Congress's implicit approval, Americans left with weakened property rights, banks affirmed as America's largest real estate holding companies, and homeowners out of a house and out of options.
It may be complicated, but I cannot think of anything more important to freedom and independence and an opportunity to move forward in this country than the protection of everybody's property rights, and this the ultimate betrayal of those very rights in this country. It is up to us and our lawmakers to stop it, in my view, before it is too late. Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, a MERS skeptic who plans to introduce legislation prohibiting the government, through Fannie and Freddie, from buying mortgages made in that MERS mortgage blender, where they may not be able to know who owns what. Congresswoman, why do you think this has even made it this far? How could a piece of legislation that is so corrupting to the basic foundation of property rights in this country even be entertained?
Because Congress has failed the American people in this mortgage foreclosure situation. And the very large mega banks and all of their emissaries, including MERS, basically march to the tune of about 6 big banks in the country. And so whether they're servicers, whether they're MERS, it's all connected to the head, the very large institutions, largely based in New York and Charlotte, North Carolina. And they've taken America for a ride because back in the early 90s, when the thrifts collapsed, which were the institutions that financed housing, the commercial banks wanted to do housing. But I said to myself, why? Because the payout is 30 years, whereas normal commercial loans they were used to making is 7 years. Well, they figured out they couldn't make as much money with housing, so they decided to hyperinflate it and to make more money. And for a while, they made a whole lot, but they brought our country down, and several countries around the world, as you know, are having trouble as well. But these large institutions have enormous power inside of Washington at the U.S. Treasury, on presidential staffs right next to the president, like the chief of staff, the heads of our Treasury, regardless of administration. They have their fangs right into the Beltway, and they don't let up that chokehold. And that's what's going on.
So I was looking at sort of some of the history here, and it's interesting because you obviously some fairly dramatic statements just offered from you, some fairly damning indictments just offered from you, but quite honestly, having done the reporting that I've been doing for years now, I don't see anything that you're saying that I can meaningfully contest. There's too much evidence to back up your statements. If you look, whether it's the money printing, whether it's the effort to eliminate property rights for the American homeowner, and you go into the history of the relationship between, people like to talk about church and state and prayer and school. Well, let's talk a little bit about business and state and the banking system and the government and that debate. Yes. And looking at Thomas Jefferson and this quote, he says, if the American people ever allow private banks, which is is what we've got, to control the issue of their currency, which they do through the Federal Reserve. The banks and corporations will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. How far from the truth, in your view, in this day is that quote?
Well, 12 to 20 million U.S. households are poised to be evicted. What do you think? We're talking about 50 million people in this country. And the very largest banks responsible for this have been completely reimbursed for their losses, all their bonuses, huge profits, and the ordinary American and the ordinary community out there is devastated. The real estate market is dead. Every recovery must be led by housing in modern history, and housing surely isn't recovering. The banks are seized up, and 6 institutions in our country now control 2/3 of the capital. That's too much. It's too much power in too few hands. We have to return power to communities, community banks, credit unions, local institutions that have respect for that property, because after all, it's where we live. And what these big institutions did was they turned a loan into a bond, and then they securitized it, and they said, now we'll never have any problem. And then they hyperinflated the value until it was a Ponzi scheme. It simply, the underlying assets simply couldn't pay out what they were projecting, and it all collapsed. So they have done great harm to the republic. They were reckless. They exhibited very high moral hazard for which they should pay a price, and many people believe there has been criminal fraud that's been a part of this.
So I agree with everything that you're saying, and more people, as they learn how this system functions, and it's an educational process for a lot of people, but as they really come to understand how the pension money and the retirement money of America was captured by the banking system and really used as blackmail to force the government to pay out all of those bonuses that you were referencing. The reason the banks get what they want is because their threat is, if you don't do it, every pension, every insurance fund, every retiree in America is going to have no money, which is a darn good leverage. How do the American people and politicians like yourself that are willing to take on those institutions get enough leverage to protect our property rights, to basically protect ourselves from this ongoing extraction and reduction by the special interest that is the banks and the government, as Thomas Jefferson feared would occur?
Well, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and you have to keep at it. A former regulator and banker named Bill Isaac has written a book called Senseless Panic. I believe that these very large institutions did create a senseless panic, and they kowtowed Congress and the Bush administration into this huge bailout that did not have to occur in the way that it did. And then they've managed to suppress real hearings in the Congress and investigations. I've tried to get an additional 1,000 FBI agents funded in order to do the types of investigations that we did back when the thrifts collapsed. We can't get that bill through Congress. What do you think that says? It says that there's collusion. It says that there are those who don't want this to proceed. And listen, these institutions have a lot of power. There are some that are quite, I think, intimidated by them. And but the question for our country is, we've had the largest transfer of wealth in American history, from Main Street to Wall Street. People are hurting all over this country. The banking system is at the eye of this storm. We have to reform it. We have to return capital formation to localities where people have a certain type of prudence and a respect for one another, certainly in the real estate market. It shouldn't be focused in these very large mega banks that don't care where we live. They just want to make money off of us, and they've created devastation across this nation. There are neighborhoods in the state of Ohio that are completely vacant as a result of their moral hazard. It is simply wrong. And the MERS issue is important because the blender that you talked about, over half of those mortgages in there are actually owned now by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which are government instruments. And what we're saying is, why should the American people have to pay for those banks' losses? Let their shareholders, let them. Let's take some of their yachts. How many houses do they really need? All those limousines, some of the dividends that are paid to these institutions. Why shouldn't they have to put some chits on the table. Why is it just the American people that have to absorb the bills for this? And that's exactly what they did. They're powerful enough to put all of their debt on the American people.
Congresswoman, I could not have said it better myself, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time not only to share your views, but to help everyone in this country who's attempting to learn exactly why it is there's not investment in our country, why it is that the financial institutions don't invest,
Dylan,
but instead
if I
take
could
money.
just mention,
Please.
If I could just mention, there are two movies, one called Inside Job and another one, Capitalism, A Love Story. This is complicated. Finance is complicated, but if people go see those movies, they'll gain a sense of what has happened. And with greater public understanding, I have full confidence in the American people that they're going to get this right.
Yeah. Well, can I add one third thing to your list? Watch
Yes.
the Dylan Radigan show every day at 4 o'clock.
All right, I'm for that.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you so much for your analysis today. We'll talk to you soon. Marcy Kaptur talking to us out of Ohio.